Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 693 for April 29th, 2018. Coming up in a few minutes.
Bourbon just seems to work as such an organic part of Southern cooking, and it's something that I try to be, very thoughtful, about my use of it, because for at least for a period in the last 5 or 6 years, it seems to have sort of wiggled its way into corners of cooking that might not have been the best ideas, and just for the sake of putting a splash of bourbon in everything.
Chef John Currence is known on Twitter as the Big Bad Chef. Around Oxford, Mississippi, where he owns 4 restaurants, he's also known as the Big Bad Chef. The James Beard award-winning chef and writer knows his bourbon as well as he does his Bourbon. And he's one of the founders of the Oxford Bourbon Festival and Auction, coming up the weekend of May 18th through the 20th. He'll join us later on WhiskyCast In-Depth with a preview of the festival, which brings together world-class chefs, world-class bourbons, music, and an auction to benefit the Move On Up Mississippi Foundation. I'll also have the calendar of events, your voice, the What I'm Tasting This Week department, and in our new Behind the Label segment, we'll find out why some rye whiskeys might make you think of pickles. That's all coming up on the weekend edition of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot-still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
This is whiskey, Johnnie Walker's Scotch whiskey, from this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnnie Walker Black Label. Step right up.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Highland Park. Last time around, we had the headlines on plans for another new distillery on Islay, and let's try to put those plans into context now. Elixir Distillers, which is owned by Sukhinder and Raj Singh of the Whiskey Exchange in London, wants to build a new distillery along the road between Port Ellen and the Laphroaig Distillery. Sukhinder Singh briefed local residents on the plans Wednesday night during a public consultation session in Port Ellen. However, he's declined interview requests until after the formal application for planning approval is submitted to the Argyll and Bute Council in the next few weeks. If the plans are approved, construction should begin early next year, with distilling to begin in 2020. No details on the size or the name of the distillery have been disclosed yet. Right now, there are 8 distilleries operating on Islay. Hunter Lang & Company's Ardnahoe Distillery near Port Ascaig is scheduled to open this summer. Diageo is still working on its plans to revive the Port Ellen Distillery with an eye toward 2020, and this project would make 11 distilleries on Islay. We'll keep you updated at whiskycast.com as more details are available. One other quick update from our last episode from Dublin. At the time, we did not have the details on the U.S. release schedule for the Jameson Bow Street 18-year-old. It's expected to be available in the U.S. starting in August, with a recommended retail price of $290 for a 750 ml bottle. Now, while I was at the release of that new Jameson, Teeling Whiskey was having its own release party across town. They're coming out with the 5th and final release of their Revival series, which celebrates the return of distilling to Dublin when they opened their distillery 3 years ago. Revival Volume 5 is a 12-year-old Irish single malt first matured in ex-bourbon barrels, then finished in a combination of cognac and brandy casks. 15,000 bottles will be available worldwide, with a recommended retail price of €120, around $146. They'll be available at first in Ireland, then gradually in Europe and other markets. The other news out of Teeling focuses on its debut single pot still whiskey from the distillery in Newmarket Square. A single cask bottling will be released in August, with just 100 bottles to be auctioned for local charities. That'll be followed by the first release of Teeling Single Pot Still whiskey in November. Turning now to Kentucky, but sticking with the theme of a distillery releasing its first whiskey, Wilderness Trail Distillery in Danville waited a lot longer than most startup distilleries usually do to release its first bourbon. They unveiled a single-barrel bottled-in-bond bourbon on Saturday at the distillery. That's right, a 4-year-old bourbon as their debut. If you miss out on the first 15 barrels they've bottled so far, the next release will come in September with 15 more barrels, followed by a December release of 10 barrels. Now, let's look at a new name for a whiskey that's created a bit of controversy over the last few months. If you found a bottle of Crown Royal Bourbon Mash Canadian whiskey in the U.S. and picked it up, you have something rare on your hands. Diageo has now finished relabeling it as Crown Royal Blender's Mash for the U.S. market, but will keep the Bourbon Mash name in Canada. Crown Royal's distillery in Gimli, Manitoba has been making a bourbon-style whiskey as one of its key blending components for years now, while maturing it in used oak barrels. Diageo had originally received TTB label approval to sell Crown Royal Bourbon Mash in the U.S., but after bottles had already reached the market, there were objections to allowing it to carry the name Bourbon Mash, since, of course, the U.S. insists that only American-made whiskeys can legally be referred to as Bourbons. So, the label approval was withdrawn, while Diageo was allowed to sell bottles that had already reached the retail market. Now, with the name change, that whiskey is available once again. And while I did receive a sample of Blender's Mash this week, I did find a couple of bottles of Bourbon Mash on a store shelf a couple of months ago. I'll have my tasting notes for it later on. Also on the Canadian whiskey front, 40 Creek has announced its plans for this year's limited edition whiskey. 40 Creek Unity was created with the help of 5 contest winners who visited the distillery in Grimsby, Ontario, back in March. They picked a blend that includes whiskeys finished with so-called high mocha wood staves, along with a 10-year-old corn whiskey and a touch of Starboard Portuguese-style wine that had been maturing for 15 years in old 40 Creek barrels. As in previous years, 15,000 numbered bottles can be reserved right now through the distillery's website, and you can pick any number available between 6,000 and 15,000. But the bottles can't be picked up until 40 Creek's annual whiskey weekend at the distillery in September for $79.95 Canadian. That's about $62 US at current exchange rates. In other news, there's been a lot of talk about the environmental impact of whiskey production in recent years, but it's become more than just an academic exercise. The Scotch Whisky Association announced this week that the industry has already achieved its 2020 goal of reducing fossil fuel usage by 20%. Distilleries in Scotland are now sourcing about 21% of their energy supplies from renewable sources, and have also met their 2020 goals already for cuts in greenhouse gas emissions, net water usage, and the use of recycled content in their packaging. And finally, let's look at the rare whiskey market now. Someone passing through Dubai recently dropped $1.2 million for 2 bottles of the Macallan 1926. Only 40 bottles were released back in 1986, with artists Sir Peter Blake and Valerio Adami creating special labels for a dozen bottles each from that collection. The collector bought 1 Blake and 1 Adami bottle from Le Clos at Dubai International Airport. Presumably, those bottles did not make the trip to their new home in economy class. Meanwhile, Skinner's in Boston auctioned a bottle of the Macallan Lalique 57-year-old single malt Wednesday for a hammer price of $61,500. That's almost a relative bargain compared to the Dubai deal. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. The news is brought to you by Highland Park. And if you're flying internationally soon, Highland Park's newest travel retail release won't cost you a wing and a leg. Voyage of the Raven honors the ravens who guided Vikings on their voyages across the sea. It's available now at travel retail shops in the UK, Europe, India, Asia, and Australia, along with shops on board several Scandinavian ferry lines. You can find all the details at highlandparkwhiskey.com. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. This coming Saturday, May 5th, is Kentucky Derby Day in Louisville, but if you can't make it to Churchill Downs, New York's Belmont Park is holding a bourbon festival that day at the track. MB Rowland Distillery in Pembroke, Kentucky is hosting a Derby crawfish boil, and it's a three-pronged party at Cooper River Distillers in Camden, New Jersey, celebrating Derby Day, Cinco de Mayo, and the distillery's final day of business. As we reported earlier this month, Cooper River Distillers will be closing on the 5th. Whiskey Live Sydney is May 11th and 12th in Australia. Milroy's of Soho in London has a Bruichladdich tasting on the 12th. And also on the 12th in London, the Whiskey Exchange hosts Cavalan's Ian Chang for a master class at Smith & Walensky in Covent Garden. The Whiskey Extravaganza hits Denver, Colorado, May 18th, and the Whiskey Stramish 2018 is on May 19th and 20th in Edinburgh, Scotland. Right now, we have 257 different events on our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. If you have a festival, a tasting, or other whiskey event coming up, just use the contact form on our website and let us know about it.
This is whiskey. Johnny Walker's Scotch whiskey. From this place, and these places in that place. These are the people that make it. This is what they sound like.
Because you're a cheeky wee blighter.
Dance like. Aye, like that. This is what they do all day. Building the great character of Johnny Walker Black Label. Aging in oak for 12 long years.
Thanks. Oh, it's gorgeous there.
What is character? It's giving a damn.
You're alright, lassie.
Which looks like this, as much as this. See, the land that shapes these people and the people that shape this whiskey all shape how bloody good it tastes.
Put the bloody game on the telly, Ella.
A whiskey as bold as it is complex. For every step you take, this is Johnny Walker Black Label, friends. Step right up.
Cut.
Can I drink this now?
Johnny Walker Black Label Blended Scotch Whiskey. 40% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. In addition to all of the other events I mentioned from our calendar of events, the first Oxford Bourbon Festival and Auction is coming up the weekend of May 18th through the 20th in Oxford, Mississippi. Of course, Oxford has an extensive cultural heritage. It was the home of William Faulkner, along with many other authors and artists, and thanks to chefs like John Currence, a thriving food and drinks scene as well. Chef John is known as Oxford's Big Bad Chef, but the James Beard Award-winning chef is also a bourbon geek. In fact, one of his books is titled Pickles, Pigs, and Whiskey, Recipes from My 3 Favorite Food Groups, and Then Some. For the last couple of years, he's helped organize an annual cuisine, cocktails, and concert-based fundraiser for Move On Up Mississippi, which supports educational and health programs for kids in the state. But this year, they decided to turn it into a full-fledged bourbon festival and auction. I spent some time with Chef John Currence on the phone Friday talking about his passions, cooking, kids, and, of course, whiskey.
It is a poison of choice, and it is insanely versatile. And I don't know if it's just versatile because I want it to be, or because it actually is. And I tend to think it's very much the latter. Bourbon just seems to work as such an organic part of Southern cooking, and it's something that I try to be very thoughtful about my use of it, because for at least for a period in the last 5 or 6 years, it seems to have sort of wiggled its way into corners of cooking that not have been the best ideas, and just, for the sake of, putting a splash of bourbon in everything. But it does, in my mind, have the ability to conjure up what some of the nuances of Southern food are all about.
And that's what's going to be on showcase at the Oxford Bourbon Festival, right?
Oh yeah, it certainly will. I mean, we encourage the chefs that will be doing the in-home dinners to think about bourbon in their dishes. We're not encouraging them, necessarily to mash it into every course, but if it's a part of a dish or two, we're certainly looking for them to consider that. But it's interesting, as much as I do, enjoy sipping bourbons of all varieties. I still find myself troubled by the idea of, these bourbon paired dinners that just sort of seem to have, continued to have been a little bit of a rage. It's just, to me, it's to sip a spirit like that is something to be enjoyed before a meal or after a meal. But, as much as folks want to sort of make a case for it, I still don't, feel like it is a, with food sort of intended spirit.
I think I can agree with you on that, because if you're sipping a bourbon, you want to spend some time with it. And during a dinner, if you're trying to do a different bourbon with each course, that sort of puts it in a rush, and you're sort of racing through it, and you're not really enjoying either the food or the bourbon.
It's not to say that, there aren't dinners that I sit down and I have a glass of bourbon and I drink that instead of having sort of wine through dinner. I certainly do, but I don't look at it as intentionally sort of trying to pair bourbon with food. I just don't think that by any stretch of the imagination that was the intention of any distiller ever.
Let's talk about the festival. You've got, in addition to yourself, some really serious chefs coming in to do these private dinners. I've had the pleasure of eating Edward Lee's cooking from 610 Magnolia in Louisville, but you've also got Mike Latta, David Cruz, and a whole lot of other chefs coming in to do this, right?
I do, and I think it's really, I've got a whole bunch of talent coming in, really more in spite of me than anything else, to the point where I'm actually sort of out of the equation and more a director of this event than I'm working in capacity as a chef. I will really be more the host, but yes, I have definitely pandered to my friends and twisted their arms, and we have put together a spectacular slate of guys whose names have been around forever, like Mike Latta, who will sort of headline the larger venue dinner that we're doing, to guys like Joe Kindred out of North Carolina, who are real up and comers, and who I think are the future. We've got Ed Lee, we've got Hugo Ortega, who was a Beard Award winner from the Southwest last year, Kevin Nashin, who was a Beard Award winner for Midwest last year, Matt Ballas from Nashville. I mean, it's a slate that just sort of goes on and on and on. And then if that wasn't enough, the real sleeper is Rodney Scott, who is going to come and cook the dinner for the auction on Saturday night. And so not only do we have these incredible chefs coming to do these fine white linen table dinners on Friday, but Rodney, who was also nominated as a beard finalist this year, is coming to cook barbecue on Saturday night.
And that's going to be a fun night. Tell me about the auction and the charity it benefits, which I know is important to you.
Move On Up Mississippi is our nonprofit foundation we started about 3.5 years ago. We're targeting initiatives currently in the state that focus, programming is already in place on childhood nutrition, education, health, well-being, and activity. And so we do an annual grant cycle where we review grants currently and sort of work as a clearinghouse to identify sort of the best programs within the community or region that are in need of help, and help grow those programs. And it's been a wonderful adventure for us because, we're able to take a significant amount of money and sort of turn the fire hose on to the chest of the folks that we identify as who we want to help, and see that money go directly to work, rather than sort of filter through a clearinghouse organization that, may get 40% of it, trickle down into a charity somewhere. And, those things, just really bother me. If we're going to put money out there in the community, we want to see it go to work. And so we have been benefactors to a number of local groups that we've seen some really nice results from the money that we've given. And what we ultimately want to do is figure out a way to create our own program that will benefit in some way the nutritional life of kids in the state of Mississippi. We have the worst rate of childhood obesity in the United States. And it's all because, we are, one, feeding our children garbage, and then two, we're not encouraging them to exercise. And the lack of exercise is a lifelong problem. The immediate effects that it has on kids, as youngsters, is a stagnant child does not have the ability to absorb and learn that an active child does. And so the fact that we've cut out physical education in public school programs is just mind-boggling to me, because one, you take out calorie burning, two, you take out the stimulus to learning. And so, we're really focusing on trying to find initiatives that get kids moving again, and eating properly. The auction is a super exciting part of the fundraiser this year. This is our third year that we've done a weekend-long fundraiser. And we just decided about 8 months ago that there was nothing like a nonprofit rare and antique bourbon auction that was going on anywhere. It didn't seem like. And that with the reach that I had into the bourbon community and the fascination that folks have with it, that there was a good opportunity for us to grab the attention of some folks that would be willing to grab some of these things up. And it's going to be an interesting auction. We've got some very interesting lots that are for sale in the form of bottles. We've got a barrel that's been donated from Maker's Mark that a group can buy and have custom bottled. They'll go to Louisville for the weekend and work through the master distiller for a day program and put their bourbon in bottles and dip it in whatever color wax they want and create labels and what have you, and walk away with 25 cases of liquor of bourbon with their label on it. And then we have a significant number of sort of bourbon and music themed trips. Part of the this weekend, while it is about bourbon, is also about music. We've really sought to become a festival that introduces sort of young, new, up and coming, but vital talent to the community. St. Paul and the Broken Bones played 2 years ago as they were just really sort of coming along. And then this year we've got a younger group now out of Nashville, originally from Michigan, called The War and Treaty, who will headline the show on Friday night, and could not be more excited about that, as music is a very big part of my life, and so blending these two things together, is an important part of that equation for me as well.
What are some of the whiskeys that are going to be up? I know you've got some Pappy. I know you got some Willet.
We're currently finishing up the negotiation or the handover of a bottle that looks like it's going to be a late 50s or early 60s very old Fitz, which would be a wonderful get. We've got a bottle of the Pappy Rye, which was Julian's last of the Stitzel-Weller recipe rye before he departed from that. We've got a bottle of hand selected 20-year-old Van Winkle that Julian and I did for bottling in 2011, and that was a single barrel run of I think 80 bottles, and this is one of those 20-year-old bottles. We've got one of the original 2009 bottlings of Jefferson 13-year-old that Sean Brock did for Husk. We've got a Willet that Sean and Bill Murray did a single barrel together that's autographed by Bill Murray, and a couple of others. It's really all sort of coming together as we speak. The nice thing is that we also have a number of silent auction lots that that include the Le Creuset bottle that Highwire did of their bottling of Jimmy Red, and I want to say there's only about 100 of those that were done, and so we have one of those. We've got a bottle from Cathead, the first whiskey distilled in Mississippi in maybe ever. And then we have some trips. We've got some nice trips to Louisville. We've got a wonderful trip to Charleston, a trip to New Orleans. It's going to be a fishing trip with me and one of my favorite people to be out on the water with, a guy named Nash Roberts down in New Orleans. And all of these involve eating and drinking, and some of them involve music. We've got a wonderful trip to Nashville to see a two-time Grammy Award winner, sort of front and center at the Ryman with meals in Nashville over Halloween weekend. It's a pretty strong lot. I mean, and then I can't believe I'm sort of completely blowing by, a weekend at Blackberry Farm, sipping whiskey and eating ham with Alan Benton.
Wow,
so
that is a strong lineup.
It's not bad, and it's funny. I was talking to Seth Thompson at the Bourbon Review yesterday, and as I was sort of rolling through all this, telling him we're really trying to keep it small, and in the first year just really deliver the event as well as possible, and hope that we get some good press so that we can build it into something bigger and better next year. He just kind of laughed. He's like, "Where do you expect to go from there?"
Yeah, I'm thinking, is Oxford, Mississippi big enough to handle this?
Well, I hope so. I hope that we can get the folks in the room that are interested, in these lots, enough to do them the justice that they deserve. But we are also planning to have an online auction platform in place so that that folks who can't actually be in the room can still have access by cell phone, to bid on these lots. There's apparently not, as hard as we've dug, a live auction software out there that folks can watch what's going on and bid by clicking. But they can bid by phone. And so that's our plan, is to have a bank of phones there that folks can call and participate in the bidding from a distance.
Well, if it gets too big, they got that football stadium in Oxford that Old Miss plays in that you guys could use if you had to.
That is actually where the auction is being held.
At the stadium?
Yeah, it's in one of the clubs at the stadium, just coincidentally enough. So
I didn't think it was on the 50-yard line, but they got a few thousand seats you could use if you had to.
Yeah, and don't think that we didn't think about it. So, but no, it's going to be a lovely evening. We're very excited. We've had some absolutely spectacular response from boutique makers, everyone from boutique makers to Bill Goldring himself at Sazerac. And I have spoken several times. Sazerac's involved. Woodford is deeply involved. Angels Envy deeply involved. It is really turned into a little bit of a who's who. And so, again, this is our grand tasting event. We're holding down to 200 or 250 people. I hope that is a successful enough event that next year, we're thinking about 500 people, that we really can grow this. And as much as this is about our foundation, this is also an event that we very much want to cultivate as a destination event for people to come visit Oxford. There's there's such this conversation, from folks that I run across that, I've always wanted to go to Oxford. I just wish I had an excuse, and a lot of them sort of in this community. And so I'm hoping that this becomes something that, will become a little bit of a marquee event for the city itself.
We've posted a link to the Oxford Bourbon Festival and Auctions website in our show notes at whiskycast.com. And thanks to Chef John Currence for joining us on WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Lagavulin, the legendary Islay single malt. Look for the classic 16-year-old along with the Distiller's Edition and the new 8-year-old Lagavulin at a whiskey shop near you. Find out more at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. I always find something interesting in the Irish Whiskey Collection shop at Dublin Airport when I'm flying home. And Thursday morning I found the Irishman Founders Reserve Marsala cask finish from the Walsh Whiskey Company. It's a blend of 70% Irish single malt and 30% Irish single pot still whiskey that was finished for a year in Italian Marsala wine hogsheads. And this single cask version is exclusive to the airport shops in Dublin and Shannon. It's bottled at 46% ABV, and the nose is dry and fruity with notes of peaches and apricots, soft spices, and a subtle sweetness. The taste is well-rounded with a touch of clove balanced by apricots, peach pie with a graham cracker crust, and a touch of honey. The finish is long and subtle, and I'm scoring the Irishman Founders Reserve Marsala cask finish a 91. Next up, let's look at Bruichladdich The Organic 2009 single malt from Islay. This one was matured for 8 years in American oak casks and bottled at 50% ABV. The nose has a nice touch of lemon zest, hints of smoke and brine, soft oak, and muted spices. The taste is thick, dry, and nectar-like with good spices and a mild peatiness, while honey, vanilla, lemon custard, and a hint of brine add a nice complexity. The finish is long and fades away nicely, and I'm scoring the Bruichladdich Organic 2009 a 91. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, makers of Bernheim Wheat Whiskey, the first new style of American whiskey to be introduced since Prohibition. Aged for 7 years in traditional open rickhouses, Bernheim's mellow taste is refreshingly smooth. Learn more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. I mentioned the Crown Royal newly rebranded Blender's Mash Canadian whiskey during the news. Had a chance to try it under the original Bourbon Mash label, but only the name is changed, not the whiskey inside the bottle. It's bottled at 40% ABV. The nose is nice and creamy with notes of vanilla, honey, a soft oakiness, and muted spices. The taste starts off light and soft at first with vanilla cream and honey notes. Then soft allspice and black pepper come in to complement the lighter notes, while not overpowering them. The finish is medium length with spices that linger nicely. It's light and very, very drinkable, but here's the thing. When I was at the distillery in Gimli, Manitoba last summer, I tasted a 17-year-old bourbon mash straight from the cask, and it was so good that I wanted to cry when they said we couldn't take any out of the warehouse. This one's nice, but it needs more punch and a higher bottling strength, so I'm scoring the Crown Royal Blender's Mash an 85. And finally, you may never have heard of Dick Stoll, but he is a legend among distillers. He worked as the head distiller at the original Michter's Distillery in Pennsylvania for many years, and is now part of the team at Stoll and Wolf Distillery in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, just off the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Stoll and Wolf hasn't been open for very long now, so while the distillery was being built, Dick Stoll went down to Virginia a while back and distilled a bunch of Pennsylvania-style rye, then brought it back to mature for about 20 months. They've bottled it now as Stoll and Wolf Pennsylvania Rye at 45% ABV, and I received a sample of it a couple of weeks ago during the American Whiskey Convention in Philadelphia. The nose is aromatic and spicy with hints of clove and allspice, touches of oak and cedar pencil shavings, honey, and vanilla. The taste is dry and woody with spices that develop quickly, great clove and allspice notes along with honey, vanilla, oak tannins, and just a hint of sandalwood in the background. The finish is long and woody with gently fading spices. And Dick Stoll clearly has not lost his touch. I'm scoring the Stoll & Wolf Pennsylvania Rye a 92. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,100 different whiskeys at whiskycast.com.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
Let's open up the inbox now for this week's Your Voice, brought to you by Lot 40. Thanks to Tom Fahey for emailing suggestions for a couple of whiskey bars in the Toronto area to add to our Great Whiskey Bars page at whiskycast.com. He recommended the Caledonian in Toronto and 21 Fur in nearby Waterloo, Ontario, and we'll be adding them to the list on the website. Last weekend, we heard from Herman Mihalich of Pennsylvania's Dad's Hat Rye on their new bottled in bond rye that will be coming out in the next few weeks. I asked Herman if he could remember the last bottled in bond rye from Pennsylvania, and thinking off the top of his head, he thought it might have come from the old Michter's distillery. But I have to admit, it really wasn't fair of me to put Herman on the spot like that. Tony Foglio emailed this week with a more recent entry. Hey, Mark, love the show. On your April 21st show, it was mentioned that Dad's Hat would be the first Pennsylvania distillery to produce a bottled-in-bond straight rye whiskey since the 1980s. But Wiggle Whiskey out of Pittsburgh has been producing one for the last couple of years on a periodic basis. And Tony included a link to back up his claim. Thanks, Tony. I appreciate the update. Before I left for Ireland the other day, I decided to have a little bit of fun. You see, a couple of years ago, my family gave me a flask for Christmas. This isn't just any ordinary flask. This thing is about a foot tall and probably holds a liter or more of whiskey. I jokingly refer to this as my emotional support flask, and I put up a picture of it on social media Monday, wondering if I could use that excuse to get it through airport security. After all, people try to take emotional support peacocks, ferrets, and hamsters on planes. But the way I see it, my flask could provide support for everyone around me. At Will Run for Whiskey on Instagram probably spoke for many listeners with this comment, I need to get one of those. And on Twitter, at Mikey Joe Dram had this, put a service flask vest on it and you're good to go. Have a safe trip. Of course, I do not mean to make fun of people who legitimately need service animals to help them, and please don't take it that way. Andy Haskins at I am Andy Haskins on Twitter had this question the other day. What is the peatiest whiskey you would personally recommend? Well, the peatiest whiskey on record is the Octomore 8.3 from Bruichladdich at 309 parts per million of phenols. I tasted it a while back and scored it 91 points, so that's where I'd recommend starting out. Of course, you can then dial back the peat levels from there. And after we interrupted the last episode from Dublin to add in the news on the Elixir Distillers project on Islay, there were some comments on social media. iLaddie tweeted this, when I win the lottery, I may start an Islay distillery too. Long stills with a malting floor, seaside cask maturation, just beside my own peat field. That's when I win the lottery, of course. Now, if I ever win the lottery, I'm not going to build a distillery. That would mean work. I'd prefer to relax and support the hard work that everyone else does making whiskey by drinking it. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always post it on the Your Voice page at whiskycast.com or catch us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or Tumblr at WhiskyCast. And if you're not doing social media anymore, you can still email me. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your Voice is sponsored by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's go behind the label now. This is our look at some of the things you don't always hear about whiskey that might help you enjoy it more, from some of the history to science and all sorts of things. Each one of us has our own specific senses of taste and smell, and there are areas where we'll never always be able to agree with each other. For instance, some people love single malts with a whiff of sulfur from having been matured in ex-sherry casks, while other people hate that smell, and still others can't even pick it up. You'll see dill show up in tasting notes for rye whiskeys from time to time. It's the same aroma you might get when you open a jar of dill pickles or pick some fresh dill from an herb garden. Some distillers see dill as a welcome note in their ryes, while others see it as a sign that something's wrong. Corby's Dr. Don Livermore is in that camp. If he gets a whiff of dill in his rye whiskey, he's in a pickle.
The dill characteristics that come over in the ryes is what we term as like souring the mash. That's where you get whether it's natural or by intent, where you can put bacteria into your fermentation, which certainly creates lactic acid, which certainly could give you that dill note in your whiskey. Rye fermentations are very difficult to run. The fermenters are difficult to clean. We take great care here to make sure everything is sterile. We want as clean as fermentations as possible to make sure our whiskey here does not have that distinctive dill characteristic to it. That's something we want to try that we inherently want in our Lot 40, whether it's right or wrong. Maybe some people like that note, that dill note in their whiskeys. We're choosing to try to make our fermentations as clean as possible to make a nice peppery rye-forward whiskey.
In other words, the only time you should get a dill note in a rye whiskey is if you're drinking a pickleback, rye whiskey and pickle juice. To me, that sounds dreadful, but some people love it, and to each his or her own. If you have something you'd like us to cover on Behind the Label, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find links for the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast and our WhiskyCast HD videos, along with the latest whiskey news, events, my tasting notes, and much more, including a complete archive of our past episodes. If you don't want to miss a single episode of WhiskyCast, especially now with 2 shows each week, why not subscribe to our podcast feed with your favorite podcast app? You'll find that link at the website, too. Of course, our cask strength conversation continues all week long online. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast. My email address is comments@whiskycast.com, and I'd love to hear from you.
This is whiskey, Johnny Walker's Scotch whiskey, from this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnny Walker Black Label. Step right up.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2018, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.